with no further ado, Anna.
Thank you very much, Katarina, and welcome back to everybody after this very nice lunch. I must say, I always enjoy moderating. It's one of the best parts of my job. So thank you, Katarina, for inviting me once again to the Free World Forum here in Stockholm. However, in these past days, I've been particularly happy to be able to take part in the discussion that we will have here on the future of the Transatlantic link. And that is, of course, in the light of the results of the US election of Donald Trump as the next president of the United States. So I must confess, so many thoughts have passed through my head these past days, from perhaps wishful thinking or optimism to almost apocalypse. So I might share that with some in the audience. We will hear more about that here today. As many of you, I guess, I have read many bright analyses of what's next and how to understand this. And for me, a couple of things come to mind especially that I think are important to emphasize as we kick off the discussion. First, I think the one thing that we do know, or perhaps the only thing to exaggerate a bit, is that with Donald Trump as president, uncertainty increases in an already uncertain world. And in the words of Timothy Snyder, the Yale professor in history, we must expect the unexpected. And that, you might say, is that easy? No, that's very difficult for the human being, given how the brain cognitively works. So that is a big challenge to us. We are not really built like that. Secondly, with regard to Europe, I think we are entering unknown territory, and that was Sir Robert Cooper who put it like that. But he also said a good thing, I think. Instead of Europe complaining about Trump not being serious, let's start getting serious about ourselves. And that's also a challenge, but it could also, in the long term, be a good thing for Europe. During the election campaign, Donald Trump has made a range of statements that put the liberal global order and the transatlantic link into question, and some would say, you could also argue, put it at risk. So given these statements, to kick off the discussion a bit, I think it's fair to ask some questions like, what will be the future value of American security guarantees in Europe, in Asia? Will America risk starting trade wars as a consequence of protectionist measures that have been indicated? Will Trump be able to spur European defense spending and cohesion on defense and security within the EU? And what will this mean for NATO? Will Trump strike a deal with Russia de facto and divide Europe into some kind of spheres of interests? And in that case, in the end, will Germany and France object? And for the Swedish part, Defense Minister Hultqvist, who has said he wants assurances from Trump that the defense agreement with Sweden is still valid, or will be valid. Will he get that? And what will it be worth? So with these questions in mind, I would like to present a very distinguished panel, and I'm very happy to have all of you on board here today. I will introduce all of you, and then we will start with Leo. But Leo Michel is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and you have been at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs for this fall. Before entering the think tank world, Leo served for many years in the office of the Secretary of Defense, covering a range of issues. I know what's NATO policy. I also think you did a lot of arms control, if I remember correctly. And then we have our Swedish delegate, Sven Olof-Petersson, SOP, one of Sweden's most prominent diplomats, and also former ambassador to the EU, to Australia, and Director General for Political Affairs at the MFA. And now I believe you're still the chairman of SIPRI, the think tank here in Stockholm. And then Karlis Neretnieks, you have joined the panel here at a bit of a later stage, but we're very happy to have you here. And we have also spent the morning together discussing how to defend Sweden. So now we will move away from the Swedish borders a bit. But you're former president of the Swedish National Defence University and also fellow and board member of the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences. So thank you very much for joining us here today. And Michel, you have been asked to give a bit of a keynote address here on what's really going on from an American perspective in the future of Europe. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks from the very start to the forum and also to the U.S. Embassy who is co-hosting this event for the invitation. Many of you in the audience may wonder if American voters understood what they were voting for. I would suggest to you that in 3 states, perhaps they did, in California, in Nevada, and in Massachusetts. In all 3 states, they approved referenda to legalize marijuana. Now, you can interpret this in various ways. Perhaps voters knew what was coming. But what I'm going to tell you this afternoon is that, as tempting as it might be, we simply can't afford to chill out for another 4 years. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about the campaign. I think my language may be a bit more pointed than the U.S. ambassador, and I can understand her position and appreciate the fact that she took the high road, as has the president, as has Secretary Clinton. Then I'd like to say a little bit more about how a transition works, drawing from my own background as a civil servant, mainly in the Department of Defense for over 30 years, and then close on some of the challenges ahead. Now, first, on the campaign, let me say that on matters of defense and foreign policy, Donald Trump's statements were not bad. They were appalling. And I'd like to give you a sample of reaction. He is willfully ignorant about the rest of the world, about our military and its capabilities, and about government itself, cavalier about the use of nuclear weapons. Another, he is a national disgrace and an international pariah. Another observation, does not have the dignity and stature to run for the highest office in the greatest democracy on earth. Another, he weakens U.S. moral authority as the leader of the free world by calling into question the inviolability of NATO's Article 5, that's the provision on collective defense. His suggestions of an abandonment of America's most significant alliance relationship. Another, shows mainly contempt for allies and seems to be unconcerned about the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And perhaps my favorite, the observation that he is a useful fool of Russian President Putin. Now, before you jump to the conclusion that I'm some lefty, disgruntled former civil servant, I'd like to point out that all of these statements come from former senior officials in the administration of George W. Bush. I'm thinking of former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, former Secretaries of State Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell. A quick quote here from a letter by 50 former senior Republican foreign and defense policy officials. The former Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, and the quote about observation that he appears to be a useful fool, that's the quote, of President Putin, comes from retired General Michael Hayden, the former director of the National Security Agency and director of the Central Intelligence Agency under President George W. Bush. So I don't think that the remarks should be taken too lightly. I would offer as well that some of the surrogates of the candidate offered problematic remarks. Problematic is about as diplomatic as I can get. The former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, referred to Estonia as, quote, a suburb of St. Petersburg, and suggested further that it's perhaps not worth risking a nuclear war over Estonia. There were also some specific proposals, well, I hesitate to say specific, but general proposals, which raised a lot of questions. Senator Jeff Sessions, a very high official in the Trump campaign, spoke in the closing weeks of the campaign of plans to increase the U.S. Army from its current level of about 480,000 to 540,000, which is actually about the height of the U.S. Army during the height of the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Plans to go to up to 350 U.S. Navy ships. That's from a current fleet of around 290, and plans already on the books to go to 308. But between 300 and 308, 350, an enormous difference. All the while expanding missile defenses, somehow putting more money into the modernization of the U.S. nuclear triad without any explanation of why this would be necessary, or the question of cost, besides saying that the world needs to know, quote, that we are not becoming some second-rate military power. I could go on, but the election is over. The results are in, and I, as a citizen, believe that we should honor the appeal of President Obama, who is a class act, in my view, his appeal for a smooth transition, since, as he pointed out, all Americans have a stake in the future presidency. So let me transfer now, or shift to a little bit of talk about the transition. What it involves practically, and I've been through several as a civil servant, it involves the appointment, and not only the appointment, but in many cases, confirmation by the Senate of up to 4,000 or so political appointees. The process in the national security agencies, meaning the Pentagon, Department of State, a limited number in the intelligence community, it involves about several hundred. Already prepared before the election night, all of the agencies, and I know this from experience in the Pentagon, prepared very thick briefing books on major issues, policy issues, acquisition issues, budget issues, personnel issues, an identification of the issue, some background, and some points which were very objective of this is what the current administration's policy or actions have been. In my day, these were very thick binders. I suspect there are more electronic means of doing this now, but the principle is the same. And that is to bring the transition teams, and these are people appointed by the campaign, the Trump campaign in this case, who will come in physically into the buildings. They're rather small teams. In the case of the Pentagon, they're a mix of people, but in most cases, they need to very quickly get some provisional security clearances. And they begin this process of trying to acquaint themselves with the state of play. Of course, they're doing two things. They're trying to educate themselves and also thinking about what position they would like to play in the future. Now, from these statements that I read from the Republican foreign policy and defense so-called establishment, it does raise a very important practical question of from where will the new administration draw its talent pool for these several hundred in the national security area, the very important positions. And it is a question. They will find the individuals. They will find bodies. There are plenty of people around who will volunteer for these jobs. Some of them, you may even find, came from the list of those who signed letters or made other statements saying, never Trump. I would not automatically call into question either the bona fides or the principles of all of those people. In any transition, there are a certain number of opportunists, but I can also imagine people who have been lifelong Republicans who perhaps did not even take public stands against Mr. Trump, but would be very privately concerned about some of those statements I mentioned, but as patriots, and I don't think the word is an exaggeration, but as people who believe that the United States does have interests that need to be protected and advanced in the world, would accept working in an administration, at least for a period of time, even if they were personally appalled at some of the rhetoric that we heard during the campaign. The process is that when the new Congress is seated, which will be on January 3rd, you'll see almost immediately the confirmation hearings set up for the cabinet level appointees. And we'll know those in advance. Whether it's tomorrow or 2 weeks or 3 weeks from now, I can't tell you. Sometimes positions are put out there and then a certain amount of vetting takes place. And it's not unheard of that nominees actually then decide maybe they don't want to go through this after all. But assuming they do, there's very little reason to believe that we won't have a Secretary of State and a new Secretary of Defense and other cabinet officials lined up to be confirmed by the Senate and to take office the 20th of January. You might even here and there, since the Senate will be controlled by the Republicans, find that some deputy secretaries and perhaps even here and there an occasional assistant secretary will be ready to go. This is not necessarily the case, however. In 2001, when George W. Bush took office, there were several, and I was still in the Pentagon at the time, several assistant secretary level and deputy assistant secretary level positions, political positions that were still unfilled. So there could be delays. Two reminders for you. Most of you, I think, understand this. Some may not, but it is important to remember that President Obama is president until January 20th. Now, the tradition is that the interim, well, I don't want to say lame duck, but the incumbent administration will not attempt new policy initiatives and so forth during this time, not to compromise the prerogatives of the incoming administration. That said, if there were to be an important crisis either at home or overseas, the president has the authority and the legitimacy to act. And he may or he may not consult, depending on the situation, with the president-elect before doing so. So the president is the commander-in-chief. This has implications for continuing U.S. military operations in Iraq, in Syria, also in Afghanistan. It also means, I believe, that what has been set in motion since the Warsaw Summit, NATO's Warsaw Summit, will probably continue without much of an interruption. The plans have been now for the first U.S. brigade combat team, an armored brigade combat team, to begin a rotational to Europe, to begin arriving, actually in Poland, and then parts of that will go to Romania and Bulgaria. The bulk will remain in Poland. I think those plans will go through untouched. The European Reassurance Initiative, which was to authorize $3.4 billion in terms of the increased U.S. forward presence in Europe, has not been criticized by Republican members in Congress, even though they have held up the defense appropriation bill that would make those funds available. So the Department of Defense is being forced to pay for this ramp up under funding authorized at last year's spending level, which is only $800 million. So this could have effect on the pace of some of those deployments, but it's good news, at least so far, that part of the Obama program affecting Europe and affecting NATO in the near term should continue. Let me shift quickly to longer term. About some of the uncertainty and some of the contradictory policies that could plague the transatlantic relationship for some time to come. Yes, there are lots of unknowns in this future Trump administration, but please, you should also not forget that the U.S. doesn't call the tune. others have a role in shaping and events. So let me point you to a couple of examples that I think will be important things to watch and to watch out for in the coming months. The counter-ISIL, or ISIS if you prefer, coalition. Mr. Trump has said that this is his #1 priority, that he's going to get this new plan from the Pentagon in 30 days. He's described it in certain ways, but I don't believe in using expletives in public audiences. So I have not heard any recognition that this deal was negotiated with 3 key U.S. allies, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. One in office may find it's a bit complicated to shred agreements to which allies are committed and then turn around and seek their help in risky but important military operations in Iraq, Syria, and let's not forget Afghanistan, where decisions about the future commitment of U.S. forces, not to mention how we will work with our NATO allies and NATO partners, including your own nation, important decisions will have to be taken rather quickly about the post-2017 presence. How would Mr. Trump react to the new Russian provocations in this area? Well, I've been living in Helsinki, where there was an intrusion into Finnish airspace the day that the Finns signed a statement of intent with the visiting Deputy Secretary of Defense. 10 days ago, a Russian parliamentarian, but one who has a certain voice on defense affairs, claimed that Norway, by accepting a rotational detachment of 300 Marines, risked making itself a strategic target. This is nuclear saber rattling that we've seen before. Your own country, by the way, has also been subjected to it, even as far back as 2013. What message will the Trump administration send to other Europeans? There have been several mentions of the upcoming French election. Trump, as you know, welcomed Nigel Farage of the UKIP party as a prominent surrogate on the campaign trail. Mr. Trump was a vocal supporter of Brexit, claimed his own victory would be Brexit plus. And his election victory was seized upon Marine Le Pen as an encouraging sign for her own party that would be part of this rejection of the political establishment. Now, Sarah Palin, in an interview with Breitbart, whose chairman is now going to become a senior advisor in the Trump administration, apparently, Sarah Palin compared Marine Le Pen's niece to Joan of Arc. Now, this doesn't say much for her appreciation of French history, but suffice it to say that if one begins to express admiration for a Front National which is anti-American, talks about withdrawing France from the integrated military structures of NATO, and you're familiar with her rhetoric about the EU. I do not think she's good news for France. I'm not a French voter, but I don't think she's good news would be good news for the United States either. The U.S. has been in the forefront of nations, and here I would say that Sweden's been very helpful here in terms of building up NATO-EU contacts in the much more pragmatic directions. The outgoing administration has taken some new directions in terms of even increasing bilateral U.S. military and defense contacts with the EU, something that for years was verboten, if you will, in U.S. defense policy. It's a positive change. Will the new U.S. administration continue that? With regard to the new agreements, recent agreements with Sweden and Finland on increased military cooperation, what will be the view of the new team over time? I do not expect these to be on the front burner of a new Secretary of Defense. And many of these now will come to technical issues that will be handled at a Deputy Assistant Secretary level. However, they are important. They are important to sustain. We're not talking about agreements that have a 6-month shelf life. We don't know. In the interest of time, I won't say too much about NATO or U.S. interest in the Far East. So let me sum up with 2 or 3 points. It may be a rocky road. In fact, I think it will be a rocky road over the next several months. I'm not a great expert on Russia, but from what I've been able to observe, I think there's a very good chance that relations with Russia and behavior that the Russians have exhibited will get worse before it gets better, if it gets better. And I'm reassured by one thing, and that is that historical experience, and you don't have to go back too far to see this. You can go to I would say, the second half of the George W. Bush administration, and you've certainly now seen this under the Obama administration for 8 years. I think there is a broad recognition in the U.S. defense and foreign policy establishment, despite some of the alarming talk that you heard during the campaign, that there are 3 reasons why the U.S. needs to stay engaged in Europe. First is the NATO treaty and the treaty commitment. It is important that that treaty be seen as an inviolable commitment, not a transactional one that depends on the exact level of defense spending of this country or that country. Not only because of our interests in Europe, but our interests globally. Imagine the situation if the United States did not come to the assistance of an ally. Imagine what in Europe. Imagine what the effect will be on the alliance, on our overall trade and security relationship with Europe. Imagine what the effect will be in Japan or in South Korea if they see the United States, that has vital bilateral defense agreements with them, does not stand by its commitments. Point 1. Point 2. If the United States does not intend to go everywhere in the world alone, we need allies and we need partners to work with us, militarily, diplomatically, intelligence, and so forth. I believe, and I believe history has shown, that we cannot have that cooperation, which is more than just equipment. It's doctrine, it's the way we think about things, it's the way we exercise, if we're not present in Europe. So we need the presence in Europe if we expect Europeans to be with us here and outside of Europe. And the third reason, even if you were so unwise as to dismiss the first 2, is that the United States' presence in Europe, symbolized principally by the U.S. European Command, EUCOM, it's only one of the combatant commanders that relies quite heavily on European basing, infrastructure, access, and so forth. Our Central Command for the Middle East, for Central Asia, flows through and takes resources from Europe. Africa Command, the same. Strategic Forces Command and Transport Command. Special Forces Command. The list is pretty impressive. So are we able to maintain all of these things if we disrespect, dismiss, and denigrate our allies? I don't think so. For Europeans, I have a couple of modest suggestions. One is to balance some of your expressions of concern, which are sincere, they're legitimate. Please try to balance out with rhetoric that suggests that somehow U.S. abandonment is inevitable, that NATO is shaken to its core, and that somehow the European Union is ready to supplant NATO in terms of defense and security. I don't think that those are practical approaches. It's hard to imagine a serious crisis in Europe where Europeans would not want the United States to be side by side with you. And by the way, it's hard to imagine a serious crisis in Europe where the US wouldn't have an interest in being there with you. There are ways that may be here and there controversial in Sweden to do so. But there are a number of positive things you can do. I already mentioned the importance of NATO-EU cooperation. Regional cooperation is very important as well. There was talk earlier this morning about hybrid issues. Your neighbor Finland is considering, I think, a very interesting proposal about creating a center of excellence. This is not to be labeled as a NATO center. Finland's not a member of NATO, not to be labeled as an EU center, but a center, small center of excellence that could draw upon not only those two organizations, but upon individual countries' expertise. I think there's a lot of promise in that. You should also, in your defense dialogue here, not ignore the importance, and don't be ashamed to talk about the importance of deterrence in the modern world. As I said, my prognosis for Russian behavior is not positive. Dialogue, yes, is important, seeking common ground, but deterrence is going to be necessary for the next several years. And part of deterrence, by the way, is also nuclear deterrence. It will be up to your nation to decide at some point if you want to become a member of NATO. I won't get into that, at least not right now. But NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. And if you expect to benefit directly or even indirectly from a strong deterrent in Europe, you might give some second thought to some of the anti-nuclear rhetoric that one hears. Nuclear deterrence is there to deter against any war, including conventional war. Finally, I think that what you've seen in the US campaign and what you will see in the aftermath now, it's a reminder to my fellow citizens, but perhaps there's a broader audience as well that needs to be reminded of the risks that happen when politics is reduced to entertainment, when civil discourse in political debate is forgotten for the sake of the quick soundbite, or when the voters of an opposition party are ignored or sometimes unfairly demonized. It's an object lesson for all of us, and I think perhaps not just in the United States. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leo, for that very both insightful and knowledgeable account of what will happen short-term transition and also in the longer perspective. I was just wondering if you could comment shortly on one thing that has been widely discussed, and that's how the checks and balances of the American system somehow will contain the personality traits of Donald Trump, as we have seen, not least in his tweets, a very mercurial temperament, one could say, perhaps, and thus creating a sense of unpredictability, while at the same time having this huge responsibility for global security. What are the checks and balances here?
Well, in the area of foreign and domestic affairs, and here I would include trade affairs as well, the president does make decisions. In foreign and defense policy, there could be interagency wrangling, but in any issue of importance, a decision paper is sent through the National Security Council, and the president makes decisions. If there are U.S. troops now on a rotational basis in the Baltic countries and in Poland, they are there because President Obama decided it. If there are the use of remote piloted aircraft to attack certain terrorists overseas, it's because there's a process that the president has approved, and so forth and so on. So in that area, he has a great deal of discretion. It remains to be seen what will happen with Congress. There are a number of members of his own party who have been at odds with him on important policy issues. Senator John McCain is one, with regard to Ukraine and the general treatment of Russia and so forth. There are a substantial number of Republicans for whom one of the biggest priorities is national debt, the financing. How you cut taxes and reduce debt at the same time that you're going to spend considerably more money, I mean, according to the projections, for defense, for maintaining Medicare and Social Security, which the candidate promised at least not to touch, and building this great infrastructure system tossed around the figure $500 billion. During the campaign in the 1980s, then candidate George H.W. Bush said that his Republican opponent at the time, Ronald Reagan, was practicing voodoo economics. I see a certain voodoo quality here, and I'm not quite sure how the balance will be struck within the Republican Party.
Remains to be seen. Thank you so much. We will move on, I think, to a more European perspective, if I'm correct. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, these days you can't help but thinking of the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, because we certainly do. I was going to be fairly brief and bring up two issues, the global agenda and Sweden and NATO. But first, my starting points, where I think that Trump should be taken seriously. He should be taken by his words. He might back down from a number of his more radical promises already about indicting Hillary Clinton, who apparently, again, is a good friend, but also on a number of other issues. But still, I think that he should be taken seriously. I think that one of the reasons that he was so generous with different kinds of attacks and promises was that he never thought he would be elected. When he said the system is rigged against me, I think he really believed it. It was a bit like the Brexiteers in UK. They never thought that they would win. And now all of a sudden he's there. And I thought he looked substantially pale when he came out from the White House after having met with President Obama. But still, I agree with Masha Gessen, among others, who say that you should listen to the autocrat and take their words seriously. So I tend to agree with Philip Stevens of the Financial Times. He wrote a couple of days ago that US would probably survive 4 years with President Trump because of the checks and balances we talked about before. But as was said, when it comes to foreign policy, defense policy, trade policy, it's up to the president to decide. And there will be substantially more problematic. So Philip Stevens said that what we call the liberal global order, or sometimes we call it Pax Americana, is probably going down the drain. We have seen part of this being derailed already during the last few years. But if the president takes a step back from leading the world, this will be a very fast development. As you mentioned, I was before EU ambassador, and I make a lot of talks about EU, and especially, of course, EU crisis. But I always start with giving the arguments why EU is so important for Sweden, for Europe, and for the world. I'm not going into that because it's quite a long speech. But there is one thing which I think is relevant also here, and that is the global agenda. EU has 7 seats around the table of G20. When the agenda for the world is discussed, it's nowadays EU and US who decide on this agenda. And what does that entail? It means that for EU and US, the starting point is always the liberal global order: democracy, human rights, rule of law, tolerance, human dignity, open markets, market economy, etc., etc. Well, so far I have been nervous that EU would not stick together and push for this common global agenda. But now all of a sudden you are afraid that the US president would take a step back and do not take an interest in this. As somebody said before, he is not really interested in EU. And I noted with interest that EU offered him an invitation for a summit, and he invited Theresa May, the Brexit Prime Minister of UK. And he was already met with Nigel Farage, as somebody said. And if that is the case, I think we are really in for trouble, because then the global agenda will be taken over by other countries: Russia, China, India, Brazil. And they do certainly not have the same starting point, a liberal global order, that we have. And that's bad for the world. I don't believe that President Trump would go as far as recognizing Crimea as part of Russia, or even lifting the sanctions maybe. But I think that it's enough if he takes less interest in these issues, because we see already today that the EU has difficulties in sticking together and upholding these sanctions. And if US is not putting EU under pressure on these issues, we will be in for a very bad situation. So I think that even in the best case, foreign policy will be unpredictable for the coming years. We will all be extremely vulnerable for the whims of Mr. Trump. And countries like Russia are likely to dramatically expand their influence they wield in the world. And the expansion will cause radical instability and fear, as it has done already. And Applebaum, as you know, said that this is the end of the Western world and the beginning of the populist international. I would add illiberal populist international. The second issue is a more domestic issue, for sure, Sweden and NATO, and how the election will influence this issue. Most Swedes here noted that after the election, the left party leader, Jonas Sjöstedt, concluded with a big smile, saying, "How lucky we are not to be members of NATO now when Trump will be the president of the US." And you can possibly disregard that because he's coming from the left party. But unfortunately, the same thing was said by our foreign minister a few weeks ago. I think a person less enthusiastic about this line of arguing is our defense minister. He continued to deepen and strengthen our military cooperation with Finland, started by the former conservative government. But I also think that he realizes very clearly that this cooperation is mainly an advantage to the Finns, less so to Sweden, if we do not anchor this cooperation in the West. And he did, and he was quite successful. He went a number of times to the US. And you have all noted how American officials have said that there is more or less a defense guarantee for Sweden. And when Vice President Biden came here, he also gave this relatively vague oral security guarantee for Sweden. And now you have to ask a question, as the preceding speaker did as well. Will this stand now with a new president? And again, I think it's important to note who will be the strategic thinker in the White House, Steve Bannon. Will this presidency continue a close bilateral military cooperation with a half-socialist country, as a friend of mine put it on the web, where the defense budget is less or just above 1% of the GDP? It's hard to believe. And then, of course, the alternative is rather difficult if this does not stand up. Normally, a country like Sweden always prefers multilateral cooperation, as most small countries do. Not so when it comes to defense issues. We have our own solidarity clause where we generously afford guarantees to all our neighbors, but we have refused so far to accept security guarantees from other countries. And of course, NATO with 27 countries would be a much better option for Sweden. There you can link up with the other countries, Germany, Norway, Denmark, UK, etc. You would have a veto right, and you would not, as in a bilateral military cooperation, sit in the lap of the American president. You could easily run your own line. Then now many say, well, we should hold on to see what happens to NATO first. Well, first of all, I think, as the preceding speaker, that NATO is too important for the president to back down from this. I think the Americans will put more pressure on the Europeans to increase their defense budgets, but NATO is too important to give up or let be. And in that case, the answer is there. It is an interest for Sweden to join NATO. Not uphold the importance of NATO and takes a step back. Then what is the problem? Then it wouldn't be a concern of ours if we would join NATO. And anyhow, we need to strengthen the European arm of the defense cooperation. And of course, Sweden should be part of that. So I think the argument still stands very strongly for Sweden to join NATO. And then, of course, How this should be done it's a difficult question to answer, but I think we have to continue the debate. We should not let this question lie down and rest until we have a more clear response. We have to continue this discussion and argue strongly in favor of this possibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to ask you then, talking about the free world and the liberal global order, Angela Merkel has by some newspapers been announced as the new leader of the free world now. And we have seen Germany both as a reaction to Brexit, but also as a reaction now to Donald Trump, pushing security and defense within the EU as an answer to these developments, expressing plans for building a common security and defense organization, and that Europe and Germany needs to be more self-reliant on security issues, and Mogherini has also echoed these kind of thoughts. What, as you have been also the ambassador of the EU and know these considerations in great details, what are your reflections when you hear these developments?
Well, I'm very positively inclined to these issues, because I think EU should do substantially more on these issues. NATO is the only show in town, so of course this shouldn't be something to replace NATO, but EU has to do substantially more. For example, the issue of a EU headquarter was raised, and the Swedish government said, no, this is not a good idea, it's just more bureaucracy and administration. That's absolutely wrong. We have had 30 defense operations all over the world from EU, and every time we put up a new military headquarter, of course we should have a standing military headquarter. And on the whole, to improve EU's ability to cooperate with NATO is extremely important. Plus, I think that if we show that we want to do more, our friends on the other side of the Atlantic will be more positively inclined to work with us. So I think, yes, this is a good idea and we should push for that.
Thank you. We will move on to our next speaker, Karlis, Neretnieks, and I wanted to pick up a bit on what we have said, and I think you will expand on that also. The interest of the US in cooperating in defense matters with Sweden, to my interpretation, it has also been driven by a realization that in defending the Baltics and standing up to the security guarantee issued to the Baltics, it's necessary also to cooperate with Sweden to secure at an early phase access to Swedish territory and so on. And that has given us a prominent position this past year in talks with the United States. Now, if we have Donald Trump saying not being so keen on automatically defending the Baltic states, perhaps, or may or may not, as he says, depending on things. Could this also perhaps influence the US interest in cooperating with Sweden? That's an open question to you, Karlis, but I'm sure you can settle that or leave it aside. Decide yourself.
Thank you, Frida, for inviting me. That question, I will answer it after I've had my presentation.
Yes, please do.
Initially, I thought of speaking of two totally different things, but okay, I can put this in. I'll also have a very brief presentation, and I will cover, let's call it, two questions. One, where I think it doesn't matter what happened in the election. The result would have been the same, regardless if Mrs. Clinton or Donald Trump became president. And the second one, where it's a really big difference between the two candidates and the result we see today, and where the damage is already done, regardless of what Mr. Trump says or does in the future. To begin with, a credible defense of Europe, or this region, is totally dependent on American support. The European capabilities, when it comes to mount large-scale operations, are totally insufficient. We have forgotten, and then I mean all Europeans, the French, the British, and the Swedes also, of course, how to conduct operations on a divisional scale, core scale, and large joint and combined operations. We have forgotten how to do it. The logistic apparatus, when it comes to support large-scale operations, is non-existent. It has to be rebuilt. And the conclusion is that the only country or the only friend, partner we have that is able to conduct, let's call it a full spectrum war, is the United States. We need the United States for our own security. We are not capable of handling it ourselves. In connection with that, and that is quite fair from the US point of view, the Europeans are not paying for their share. Mr. Trump has declared that extremely clearly, but I'm convinced that Mrs. Clinton also would have told us, you have to do your part. So there, I think, there is no difference, would have been no difference. But there's another thing that's far more dangerous, and it's a far bigger problem. And that is how Mr. Trump is assessed in Moscow. Will this president stand up for US allies regardless of the consequences? Is the US prepared to risk a major war for Riga, Warsaw, or whatever part of Europe? And here, the damage has already been done. As Mr. Michel said, this about we will support those who are doing their fair share, is qualifying who he might support in case of a crisis or a war. And that also, there Michel mentioned that Estonia is just a part of the suburbs of St. Petersburg. Regardless of any excuses or clarifications now afterwards, or when the president is installed, these were extremely dangerous comments because they illustrate a state of mind. They don't illustrate policy, they illustrate a state of mind. And decisions by military adventures or whatever are seldom based on assessing objective factors, military strength, economics, or such things. They are very often based on attempts to analyze the innermost thoughts of your opponent. And history is full of examples where, let's call it brinkmanship, based on such calculations, have miscarried. I will just mention two. The most obvious one is perhaps Hitler's miscalculation when he thought that Britain and France would not fight for Poland, and then we have the Second World War. We have a more recent one, and that will be Mr. Khrushchev's miscalculation when it comes to resolve of President Kennedy to stand up during the Cuban Missile Crisis, nearly leading us to a Third World War. And we should do very well to remember that the truth is in the eye of the beholder, Mr. Putin in this case, not what we think, what we know, or what we assume. And when it comes to the inner convictions of Mr. Trump and his associates, I'm very much afraid that Moscow already has come to some kind of conclusion that ought to be very scary for us here in the Baltic region, Baltic Sea region, and in Europe. But I won't end on that, let's call it, pessimistic note. There is a silver lining on the cloud also. If the Russians at the same time come to the conclusion that Mr. Trump is an extreme pragmatist, a real businessman, So that could also be a deterring factor, because then they would never know if he would change his mind overnight, depending on new circumstances that might appear for one reason or other. So in the end, perhaps, and that's the optimistic part, unpredictability on behalf of Mr. Trump could also be a deterrence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You can give my question a bit of a thought.
Oh, okay, can I?
No, please answer it if you have to. Would you think there is a risk that we are decreasing in interest, since there might be less of an automatic response increase or feeling on how to do if the Baltic is threatened?
To summarize the whole problem, Sweden's security is totally dependent on what's happening in the Baltic states. Mm-hmm. If the US, mainly, or NATO, wants to defend the Baltic states, then they have to use Swedish airspace and Swedish sea territory, primarily. So the real question is, does Mr. Trump or will Mr. Trump back up the Baltic states in case of a crisis? If he wants to do that, then we automatically become a partner to the US in that endeavor. If he's reluctant, then we are, I don't know if it's a correct British expression, but in deep water.
Thank you. I know we have a very distinguished audience, so I also want to allow time for questions, and there are microphones, and if you please introduce yourself, organization that you represent. Just raise your hand. So we have over here.
Anke Schmidt-Weizmann, Swedish Institute of International Affairs. I wanted to ask, since you all directly or indirectly talked about that EU-NATO connection, what impact you expect the Cyprus, Turkey, Greece issue to have in the future? So if you could share some thoughts on the Trump effect on that long-standing problem between the EU and NATO, since that is kind of the crux of the problem of the lack of cooperation or the insufficient cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to go? Perhaps Sven?
Well, as you know, clearly this has been the relationship between Cyprus inside the EU and Turkey has been a break on our cooperation with NATO for a very long time. Now, as it looks, there might be a solution coming up on the Cyprus issue, and that would be really a blessing in these very dark circumstances. However, you still have to be a bit cautious about that, considering the president of Turkey and his way of looking at different things. Maybe he would like still to play this card against the EU or whatever. But if that could be an issue that we could put behind us, of course, that would facilitate immensely our cooperation between EU and NATO. But nevertheless, there has been a substantial improvement when it comes to cooperation between the EU and NATO already, in spite of this problem being still on the table.
I'd like to underscore the last point, that we've come, thankfully, in my view, a long way from the type of open competition between the two organizations that was really to the detriment of both organizations in the early 2000s. And the evolution began, there was a learning process that the previous administration, George W. Bush, had to learn, and that's been advanced now. And so much of it is below the radar screen. But in terms of formal relations, the presence, for example, of the High Representative at meetings of NATO defense ministers and presence of the Secretary General of NATO at important EU meetings. There are important relations between headquarters. There are important things that have taken place in terms of practical cooperation between NATO's Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation, happens to be, for the third time now, a French Air Force general, very capable one, and the European Defense Agency. And these are very positive things. And what I saw coming out of the Warsaw Summit was a very positive message about how those practical type of contacts could be given new life in a number of ways, to include in cyber and so forth. That's very, very positive. It hasn't happened yet. What I would regret, and I think would be unfortunate, would be to return to the rhetoric of 10 to 15 years ago, when the paradigm was, well, Europe, the United States either doesn't care or won't care at some time in the future, so Europe has to do things alone, autonomously, and so forth. Setting up a competition is not a good idea in terms of resources, in terms of doctrine, in terms of what we need to do together in the world. So I would just, my plea is for continuing the practical cooperation. It's my understanding that, once again, your country, Sweden, has been very helpful here. And let's not get back to the, well, the Americans are leaving Europe, and so this is time for Europe to somehow pull up its bootstraps. I agree, sir, with your conclusion at the end that perhaps I would not have been quite so stark in deference to the sensibilities of the audience, but European security will depend for the foreseeable future on the American guarantees, not least of which in the nuclear area. And so let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, as we say in the United States.
Issue to that is, even though EU-NATO cooperation has been driven mostly by perhaps non-military issues more related to hybrid threats or migration and so on, moving from nice to need, a pulling factor also from the present US administration, or pushing factor, has been also the need for Europe to get more involved in the defense of its own continent, and related to that is also the extreme tiredness of this lack of defense spending, which is also reflected a lot in NATO, but it also has a reflection on the EU and EU-NATO cooperation, I think. And will this actually be some kind of, might this be some kind of positive result, if you think it's positive with more defense spending from the Trump presidency, that he's actually now really pushing this issue very hard, and there is something to it?
Well,
how can we interpret this in a way that we can build something constructive on this issue?
I would have expected, and in fact she made them during the campaign, I would have expected calls also from Secretary Clinton for a greater European effort, generally speaking, in terms of defense, to include in defense investment. But I would give you 2 or 3 points of qualification. One is, this is not new for U.S. administrations, Democratic and Republican. What was new and most disturbing, and I would say dangerous, about Mr. Trump's rhetoric, at least during the campaign, was to imply that defense spending level, which I don't believe he understood, was a factor in whether or not the United States would meet its treaty commitments to defend an ally. It's one thing, you know, as a family you jostle about what can you do, but it's never, I'm going to sacrifice my son or my daughter or whatever to somebody else's interest because somehow they haven't paid their debt. That is really an important dividing line. The other thing is, in all fairness, you know, you could set levels at various percentages, but it is a little bit unfair to say, well, the U.S. spends about 3.6% of its GDP, Europeans on an average spend less than 2%, and therefore you're somehow 50% paying less. The United States spends a lot of money for global security issues, which, yes, Europe benefits from, but our European allies didn't sign up to defend Japan, didn't sign up to defend South Korea or Australia. And a lot of the U.S. defense budget is for global commitments that are not part of NATO. So it's a little bit unfair to say, oh, the U.S. spends 73% of NATO spending. It's simply not true. We contribute 22% to the NATO common fund and budgets, it still means that Europe and Canada are supplying the other 78%. It's not such a bad deal for the United States after all.
Good perspective. Are there more questions? Here we go.
Thank you. Mats Johansson, Stockholm Free World Forum. I have a question for Sven Olof-Petersson about tactics in Sweden debating NATO membership, and that goes for Karlis as well. Should we try to pretend that nothing has happened, or should we go attacking Defense Minister Hultqvist for the breakdown of the Swedish foreign policy doctrine? Should we stop talking about NATO membership for a while until we know what is happening? Or what should we do?
Well, I'm not sure it's for me to say, but my views on this is that, first of all, I see basically the defense minister as an ally on this issue. So he should not be the main objective for our criticism. But there are those who, for example, raise this issue about not being able to join NATO now when we have Trump as a president. Those statements should, of course, be strongly attacked. And then I think it is reasonable to try to explain that this alternative of bilateral military relationship sitting in the lap of a president who is completely unreliable is a much more delicate and difficult and dangerous proposition than being members of a multilateral alliance. So I think we should use the issue of our bilateral military relations with the Trump government as an argument to join NATO. And then, of course, people will say, as I try to outline, is this really something good when we don't know what will happen to NATO? But again, I think this will blow over pretty fast. NATO is long-term too important to the US. So pretty soon we will see that the NATO alliance will survive and we continue to be as important as before. So I think we should not let this issue rest or wait for a better, brighter future. I think we should keep the fire burning and make it clear that there is no alternative to NATO membership, basically.
Yes, to begin, we are very much again with, don't attack Mr. Hultqvist. I personally have known every defense minister since Tage Pettersson, and that's
oh gosh,
yeah. And he's the best one we have had in modern times. He's doing his really best in an awful environment. That means the government. So that's one thing. Then one important thing that we really should concentrate on is trying to stop this argument that now Trump is president, now we have to keep outside NATO. Because if we don't try to stop that way of arguing, it will become a fact. And that would be extremely bad in all ways, really. So, exactly as Sven Olof says, we have to stop this argument, and secondly, we have to continue to work as well as we can to present good arguments why joining NATO. And the main one is, of course, we can't defend ourselves at the moment. Perhaps we can sometime in the future, but not in the foreseeable future. And it's also quite unlikely that Mr. Trump will be president more than 4 years, to my mind.
Yeah. Before I let the panel go, I would really like you to touch upon the issue of trade a bit more, because TTIP has been described by, I think, by Secretary Clinton as the economic NATO or something like that, a strategic instrument. It has been seen on really spurring the partnership between Europe and the US towards the future. And while Donald Trump has been pretty clear on TTIP I mean the Asia
TTP.
TPP.
Yes, and NAFTA. He's been less clear on TTIP towards
Hasn't said
Europe.
anything on that.
Hasn't said anything. So what do you read from that? Is there still a hope for that, given though that there are problems also in Europe on the treaty? But from the American side, what would you expect?
I'm not an expert on trade law, but I would refer those who are interested in it to go to the website of the Peterson Institute, which is a very reputable institute, and they have one of their experts there who about 6 weeks, 2 months ago, wrote an article specifically on this, and his basic conclusion is that the president has a lot of authority over trade agreements, and not only in the direction and so forth, but actually authorities, depending on how it's written, for announcing that the U.S. is withdrawing within a certain provision of 6 months, and can do that without subjecting it to a vote for authorization or approval from Congress. So on that, I would recommend the Peterson Institute. I would say, as a private citizen, but as a voter who, you won't be terribly surprised, voted for Hillary Clinton, it was one of the elements of her campaign that personally and I think some other Democratic voters were disappointed with. Her robust support for these trade agreements when she was Secretary of State, and then what appeared to be, to an outside observer, a politically motivated distancing herself from those when she was the candidate. I think that's very unfortunate. But the anti-trade sentiment does exist. Mr. Trump certainly, one element of his appeal was that, and it's something that you have to deal with. But all of these things involve trade-offs, and that's where some of the inconsistencies worry me. With regard to China, he spoke loosely about slapping these 45% import charges on Chinese imports. And then in a different speech will say, hey, and I'm going to get China to be more forceful in terms of controlling North Korea. You know, how do you do these things together? Mexico, the Mexicans have had an expression for a long time, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. And I suppose they're repeating that a lot more these days as well, with talk of import duties, talk of a wall, and so forth. I don't know how this is going to work out, but he's made such clear statements and repeated statements during a campaign. I'm not so sure he's going to be quick to back away from these things once January 20th comes and he's in office.
I think it is this agreement with 11 Pacific Rim countries. I think that probably he will have to renegotiate the NAFTA agreement. And I think this is doable. It will be small details which he can blow up out of proportion and declare victory, and then it will remain. But the problem with these kind of agreements is that they are between a highly developed country, the US, and a number of developing countries. And there the American public, especially the American white working class, are fearful of salary competition. That's why I think that long term, though TTIP is put on the back burner for a couple of years for sure, but long term this is such a beneficial proposition for both countries that it will be brought up to surface again. Because there we are not competing with low salaries or with different working conditions, etc. Here it's not a matter of tariffs at all. As somebody said, the tariffs between Sweden and between EU and US is at an average 4%. It's to have common norms and standards. And this is immensely advantageous if we can have the same standards and norms between US and EU, because that would be the standards and norms of the world. And people in Europe, as in the US, fear that these standards will be lowered or less beneficial when it comes to environment, working standards, health, etc. But this is all rubbish. We have basically the same standards on these issues. What would happen is that other countries would have to adapt to this. Enormously beneficial for industry in Europe and in the US. So I think this will come back. It might take a couple of years, but it will come back.
Karlis.
I would like to make a security aspect on these trade agreements. It's the TTP in Asia that, to my mind, is the most important one, really. Because if you look, as an outsider at least, at the US, Russia and Europe is some kind of, let's call it, a security problem. But when it comes to the US role as a global power, then Asia is a bit more important, especially China. So if the US doesn't do its utmost to keep its ties with the Asian countries, allies in Asia, that's more serious than handling Europe, really. And a part of this keeping in touch, reassuring its Asian allies, there's also a military component. And even the US resources are not endless. So if they have to prioritize Asia, it will be let's call it, at the cost. We will have to carry the burdens ourselves. The US will not be able to afford it in the long run, really. So the TTP is extremely important. TTIP, okay, it's a good thing if you have it.
But from a strategic point of view, possibly that was the Obama argument. But I don't think that is how Trump sees it. He sees this as an exclusively economic proposition, and he's not prepared to let Korea or Latin American countries into the American market in a more favorable, with more favorable conditions than they have already. So
Unfortunately not.
No. And one could even argue that TTIP is less, from a Trump perspective,
it's less threatening.
because it has less to do with job opportunities.
Exactly.
The way they are, you can reason about if you look at Asia. I think it's time for us to round up. It's hard to conclude this session. Lots of question marks. I don't think they got less. Perhaps we added a few. I will take with me at least, I think you all emphasized the importance of the institutions that we have. Both to prepare perhaps for a different mindset nationally, but also to guard the institutions that we have and the cooperations with them, and to look at them openly in various perspectives. So thank you all for...
I have a conclusion.
Yes.
Very clear one.
Yes.
There are two possible outcomes. One is very bad, and the other one is less bad.
Yeah. That sounds like a good diplomatic conclusion to round up this session. So thank you very much for that one. Okay, please join me.